While the glory of the Roman legions is still known today, the navy is rarely mentioned. But ships also ensured the power of the empire. Before the First Punic War, the Romans had virtually no navy of their own. If necessary, warships were provided by their allies, for example, the Italic Greeks, and they had not yet conducted large naval campaigns. But the clash with the largest maritime power, Carthage, required the Eternal City to create its own large military fleet. Since the Greeks and Phoenicians had achieved great skill in shipbuilding, the Romans had only to adopt their skills. In antiquity, warships were mostly long. The Romans called them naves longi, long ships, and were propelled by oars, thus becoming less weather-dependent and maneuverable, although they had up to 3 masts and sails. Unlike military vessels, merchant ships had a rounded shape. To increase the speed of ships, rowers on them were placed in 2 and more tiers. Depending on their number, ships were classified. Moners were called ships with 1 tier of rowers, biremes with 2, triers with 3, tetrars with 4, penters with 5 tiers, and so on. Antique authors also mention ships with 32 tiers of rowers, but here, as historians assume, they mean unique large ships on which on the upper tiers for each or sat a few people. The main type of warships in the 3rd century before Christ were still triers, on which rowers sat in 3 tiers. Not very expensive, they had a good ratio of speed, strength, and reliability. The Greeks had invented this type of ship in the 6th century before Christ, and the Romans and their allies had experience in their construction. But by the time of the war with Carthage, at this opponent of Rome in the fleet began to prevail larger penters, 5-deck ships. Triers to cope with such was not easy. Strong ships are difficult to ram, and their deck is higher, allowing the enemy to bombard the smaller ships. But the Romans were lucky. They managed to capture a grounded Carthaginian ship and modeled it after hundreds of penters. With tremendous energy, using the funds of wealthy Romans, masters of Italian shipyards created the first large naval fleet, and the captains collected teams freelancers. Even as rowers, slaves were not used then, the notorious slaves on the galleys appear much later. The Romans made their own improvements. Thus, on their ships appeared ravens, metal ladders, which resembled a beak hook clung to the deck of the enemy. On them, Roman infantrymen ran over to the enemy ships and began hand-to-hand combat. So they turned the sea battle in a similar land battle, where they were particularly strong. Thus, if the ravens initially caused ridicule of the enemies, then soon Carthaginians them intimidated. Previously, they were not afraid of anyone in the sea. The appearance of a large Roman fleet was quite unexpected. Except for the drying time of wood, the construction of Pentera required only about 60 days. Now the time of power of the Carthaginians had passed, and it was broken in the course of only a few battles of the war. The number of Roman ships, during the war they built up to 1,000, the number and strength of their marines, which the enemies did not have, the bet on boarding combat, all this allowed Rome to defeat the Carthaginian fleet and destroy up to 500 Pentera. The Romans themselves lost about 700. This success played a huge role in the Second Punic War. When the famous great commander Hannibal marched on Rome, he was unable, despite his brilliant victories, to gain a foothold in Italy and finish off the Romans, because having lost its superiority at sea, Carthage could not give its hero timely and in the right amount of reinforcements. After this war, the Carthaginians completely lost their power and influence, and their city was destroyed by Rome. After this, the Romans almost ceased to engage in the navy. There was no one to defeat and no need to build large and expensive warships. In naval battles, the Romans again used the ships of their Greek allies while the old Roman ships were rotting in the docks. There was a decline in the navy, and as has always happened in history, where there is a lively maritime trade, but no strong military fleet, piracy flourishes. Pirates in the Mediterranean Sea became a formidable force. Their bases covered the northern coast of Africa, Dalmatia, Asia Minor, and even the islands near Rome, Corsica, and Sardinia. Their wealth became such that the pirates did not know where to put their money, so that some of them, according to historians, silver-decorated oars. For a while, the Romans treated it indulgently. In some ways, pirates brought and benefit, for example, fueled the slave market. But their appetites grew. At some point it became clear that, because of the pirates, becomes a real threat to food security of Rome. And the Romans had to get to grips with it. Pirates have already begun to raid Roman villages and towns, capture for ransom noble persons, so was once captured and Julius Caesar. Several naval leaders with small fleets were not able to defeat the pirates by that time. But when the case took Gnaeus Pompey the Great, for which built 270 ships, the pirates were defeated unexpectedly quickly, just 3 months. Methodically and decisively Pompey drove the pirates to their bases, and then forced them to capitulate. Several hundred fairly small ships, mostly Moner and Byram, were captured. Up to 20,000 pirates were taken prisoner. When Egypt also came under Rome's rule, the Mediterranean Sea finally became the inland lake of the empire. So in about 2 centuries Rome became the absolute ruler of the sea. Since then, the Romans again stopped building expensive large ships and mostly limited themselves to Byrams to fight pirates, protect merchant ships and deliver soldiers on the rivers, for example, in wars against the Germans. During the late empire, the navy fell into decline again, never again reaching its former glory, even when it was attempted to be recreated to fight the Vandals in the early 5th century. The heirs of Roman naval warfare and shipbuilding were already the Byzantines and later the Italians, who developed the achievements of antiquity until the beginning of the firearms age.